Hello, welcome. So this session is going to be on kind of how colleges and universities can listen to students, how to make higher ed student-centered. So I'm going to first introduce the panelists, and then we're going to jump into kind of introductions. So I have over here Marni Stein from Western Governors University, and Ben Wildavsky from Strada Education Network, and James Toscano, partner for the College Affordability and Public Trust. So Ben, why don't you start off? Tell us a little bit about you, kind of what you do, what brings you to this conversation, and I know you have some slides that you want to talk about.
I do have some slides. Well, I'm Ben Wildavsky with Strada Education Network, and I'm just recently started at Strada, but I've been writing for many years about higher education, and am really very excited to be talking about some of the issues that we really focus on around how to build better and more purposeful pathways between what people study after high school and the kind of work they end up doing.
Okay, and Marni, why don't you go?
I am Provost and Chief Academic Officer at Western Governors University. Western Governors University is one of the largest nonprofit, fully online universities in the country, and we are the only competency-based education based university in the country of our scale.
And can you explain competency-based in case people don't know?
Sure. So competency-based education is education that is based on mastery of skills and capabilities rather than time. So while we have terms, our unit of measure for student success and student progression is mastery of performance-based assessment and objective assessments of competencies rather than a 15-week term. So that's what competency-based education is, and the competency-based approach can be applied to almost any discipline. People often think of it as a technical form of education. It is not. You can apply competency-based assessment and competency-based pedagogical approaches to almost any field of study, which we do. We have 4 colleges and 66 programs that span the gamut from our Teachers College to our Health Professions College to our IT College to our Business College. We have 115,000 full-time students and over 130,000 graduates. We've been around for only 20 years, so it's been a really fast couple of decades, growing from just a handful of students to a really large cohort in a very short time. My own personal background in higher education has taken me from working to large state universities, both in the United States and abroad. I've worked at the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia University in the city of New York. I've also worked with the University of Texas system. So I have a broad view of the workings of higher education and the interests of higher education in serving students, and I'm really happy to be here today to share my perspective.
Cool, and we'll get into kind of how WGU is listening to students later on. James, why don't you go? An introduction, tell us who you are and kind of what you bring to this conversation.
Okay, thank you. So my name is James Toscano. I'm the president of a group called Partners for College Affordability and Public Trust, and we work on amplifying the consumer voice in higher education decision-making, focused on state policy and also institutional policy, particularly around college affordability issues, price setting as a great example and a very controversial one. And so my background, I spent the last 7 years at one of the nation's largest community colleges as a vice president, and also I've taught at a liberal arts institution, university, and so sometimes people confuse a critique about higher ed as something that's not done lovingly, but when the things I have to share are really from the perspective of somebody who's worked on the inside and really thinks that we have a lot more to offer American college students and their families.
Great. So we're kind of here to talk about how colleges can be kind of more student ready. We always hear how students are college ready. We talk less about kind of how colleges are student ready. I want to jump into kind of that basic question of like, what are the ways that colleges can listen to students? And which leads me to you, Ben, if you could talk a little bit about kind of the polling that Strada has done with Gallup.
Sure, absolutely. Well, thank you very much. And again, I'm really happy to be here to talk about some of the research that Strada has done in partnership with Gallup. And I'm just going to tell you briefly why we're doing this work, why we got into it, why we've devoted a lot of resources to it. And I'm going to give you just pretty briefly 3 major takeaways from our research. So, we at Strada, like many others, have been concerned for a long time about a real disconnect that exists between education and employment. And it really has to do with the differences in views between what educational consumers feel they're getting out of education in terms of workforce preparation and what employers think they're getting and what colleges themselves think they're delivering. So we know that students, really the main reason students pursue higher education is to try and get a good job, to be able to support themselves and their families, and no other reason really comes a close second. So we find that 60% of degree holders say that work outcomes are the main reasons they enroll, and just about 4 in 10 Americans either agree or strongly agree that college grads are really well prepared for success in the workforce, and with business leaders it's even a little bit lower. Just about a third agree or strongly agree that graduates are ready. And meantime, college leaders have a very different view. Almost universally, they think that they're doing a great job, or at least a decent job, in preparing students for jobs. So you can see 95% of chief academic officers give themselves pretty good or great ratings. So really what we, I think, set out to do is to figure out what's the story, what's going on here. And, we believe, of course, like many others, that for education to really deliver on its promise of opportunity for individual communities, for students, for the nation, we had to really tap the insights of the people who know best how education is or isn't working for them. And of course, that's consumers. So,
how many students were in this? Could you back up a little bit?
You are not at all. You are anticipating a very large number on a slide coming up, but I'll just go ahead and go straight to the number, which is over 300,000 students have now been surveyed in this the research we've done with Gallup. We're doing, I'm trying to remember, the daily number is something like 350 interviews every day, so that's 122,000 every year. It's really a massive database, and what's exciting about that is it means that we have big enough numbers that we can really do, of course, it's a nationally representative sample, but we also can do state level, numbers. We cover all demographics, all top metro regions, et cetera, et cetera. And in addition, we also have an alumni survey. We have a survey of current college students. We have a survey of employers. So we're just kind of awash in data. And we partnered with Gallup on all this, and I can just show you quickly, some of what I've just gone through, some of the characteristics of the survey. And to try to sum up what we found, obviously, as I said, it's a huge data set, it's very rich, but the 3 takeaways that I'll just go through pretty briefly now are really about how we can close the higher ed workforce disconnect and how we can deliver greater value. And so the key number 1 is that we have to connect education and employment in ways that make coursework relevant to students, and of course the coursework has to be accessible to students as well. I'm very interested in some of what Marni had to say. Just to digress long enough, one of my favorite phrases about competency-based learning is the idea that this is something where learning is the constant and time is the variable, rather than vice versa, which is how it so often is in traditional higher education, where you have certain seat time requirements and people may or may not master the material at the end of it. But what we found is that really what matters most to consumers is the education that they experience is relevant. Now, I hesitate a little bit with this word relevant because sometimes that can be a buzzword. This is not that old kind of tired false dichotomy of the philosopher versus the welder. That is not the choice that we face when we talk about relevance. We really feel that you can increase value at every degree level and in every field of study if you find ways to really thoughtfully connect learning to a future career path. So, for example, my colleagues, we have a terrific sort of in-house think tank at Strada called the Strada Institute on the Future of Work. They did a study a few months ago called Robot Ready, Human Plus Skills for the Future of Work. And it was done in partnership with MZ, which is an economic data forecasting firm that's part of the Strada network. And what they found is that demand for liberal arts is quite high, and the value of liberal arts is quite high, but that colleges need to do a better job really harnessing those kinds of skills to purposeful career paths for students. I mean, maybe this is self-interested. I'm a recovering comp lit major, so I've done the liberal arts thing, but I think that it's important for students to understand how having analytical skills, writing, synthesis abilities, all those are things that can lead you in a lot of different directions, particularly if you get the chance to sort of try out those skills. So we know that people who experience education that they feel is relevant are more likely to say their education was worth the cost, and they're more likely to say their education was high quality. So just to briefly unpack this slide, it says relevance is strongly linked to consumers' perception of quality and value. And what we did is we basically constructed this relevance measure, and we combined two things. The first is what adults with some college say about whether their coursework was relevant to their work. And the second is what they say about whether they learned important skills that they put to use in their daily lives. So when you put them together, basically the pattern is pretty clear. Those with high relevance scores are pretty likely to agree that their education was worth the cost and was high quality. And we know, of course, that among economists, for example, and among policymakers, the connection between post-secondary education and job opportunity is well established. And of course, lots of working adults agree. We found when they were surveyed, about half said that they really feel they need more education to advance in their careers. But what's interesting is that they're not necessarily assuming that that's going to mean education at traditional institutions. For example, when we asked consumers with less than an associate's degree, the largest percentage told us that they look to employers as the most likely source of future learning. So here's how some of the other options are. So you can see that after employers, community colleges come next, followed by vocational programs, and you can also see there's some online options that are in there as well. So this suggests, that if we're trying to connect education and employment through relevant coursework, we have to make sure that the coursework is accessible in places and in forms that students can really take advantage of it. And that suggests that we probably have to look beyond the preferences of traditional students as well as traditional educational models. I don't think here, I was talking to somebody this morning, and I did an interview on the South by Video team did an interview with me, and I think people always want to know about the future of higher education, and are we going to blow everything up and have a whole brave new world? And I think it's really important to think of this more in terms of both and than either or, because that's where I think things are going to develop. So key number 2, we need to do much more to strengthen advising and mentoring. And I think in education, when it comes to connecting education and careers, relationships are really transformative. They're really important. And the degree to which students feel supported by faculty members, cared about, that impacts their perception of their entire educational experience. But clearly we're not doing as well as we could be and should be in this area. We found that only 43% of grads felt that they had a mentor as undergraduates who encouraged them to pursue their goals. And interestingly, we found in our work with Gallup that faculty are the most common source of mentorship among undergrads who have a mentor. And nearly 2/3 of those who had a mentor say that their mentor was a professor. But unfortunately, there are some very significant equity gaps here. I was really quite surprised by these numbers. Even among students who do have a mentor, non-white students are much less likely than white students to have a professor as a mentor. So that's 72% for white students and just 47% for minority students. But interestingly, when you look at the historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs, you find that that really changes, and that black students at those institutions are much more likely to experience mentoring and to have other supports than their peers at other universities. And one reason I think that faculty play such an important role as mentors is that career advising just isn't seen as very useful by a lot of students. One more statistic here, 39% of students say they have never visited their school's career services office. And that's not exactly a resounding vote of confidence. That said, we have discovered that students who may not have the strongest personal networks for career advice are more likely than others to view this kind of advice from career services and from other kinds of advisors as useful. And about 7 in 10 first-generation students, for example, consider that kind of advice useful, and that's about 7 percentage points higher than people whose parents hold a 4-year degree. And I think that's really striking because it suggests, that strengthening career advice, obviously, it's good for everybody, but it's especially helpful for students who maybe don't have those networks, who need more help getting plugged in. And that's where we could really add some value, I think. And in fact, if you'll forgive me, just another little Strada mention here, we have given a grant to the UIA, the University Innovation Alliance, to try to do a lot more at their member institutions to improve career services. And I think that's very exciting, because I think that really gets to another angle. We sometimes think about the classroom and majors when we think about what gets students on to success after college. But clearly, that's an important link that's not working so well right now.
It's also interesting, this 39% of students who have never visited, it's certainly an onus put on students, if you think about it in terms of kind of like, the institution's not doing too much in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. You know, I'll just mention one last point on advising, which is that we also found that when it came to deciding what field of study to pursue, we asked all adults who answered our big main survey which sources of advice they used most often, and also which sources were most helpful. And what's interesting is that they were most likely to use advice from sources like guidance counselor, teachers, family, friends, you know, the people you might expect. And they were least likely to use advice from people at work, like employers or colleagues. But when you ask them what was most useful, it was the work-based advice that was most useful to them. So one interpretation of this, I mean, here I'm certainly going beyond what's in the hard numbers, but I think a very plausible interpretation is that when people are trying to make decisions about their studies, they often aren't connected to people in the workforce who might give them the kind of more directive advice about the kind of credentials, whether it be a certificate or a qualification of some kind or a full degree, that's actually going to help them advance professionally. And that's especially true for younger adults. And that's actually a great segue to my last point here, which is it's really about the benefits of connecting students to the workforce, not only through this broad point of relevance that I've mentioned, not only through the advising that I've mentioned, but through various kinds of applied learning opportunities. So key number 3, you know, to improving value is connecting education and employment through applied and experiential learning. And we know that relatively few students have experiences like internships. Just about 30% of graduates had an internship or a job where they got to apply what they learned. And employers, you know, really have to play a greater role. A lot of employers, when you survey them, say that we value job-specific skills. But, and not only that, but they say if they have an internship program, they say we think it's a really valuable program. But 63% don't provide internships. That's just the flip side of this slide here. And just as employers need to do more to connect education with employment, so do colleges. You know, one more indicator from our research is kind of noteworthy here. Education consumers generally give high rankings to the quality of traditional dimensions of undergraduate education, teaching, and instruction. Their ratings of applied learning, the kind of stuff I'm talking about here, are somewhat lower. They're just a little bit above here on this chart the pretty low marks they give for things like academic advising and career advising. So this suggests that not only could colleges be doing more with applied learning, they could also be doing it better. So I'm just going to wrap things up by saying that I've talked about this disconnect between higher ed and employment that led us to focus on education consumers in our partnership with Gallup. And I've just quickly reviewed these 3 takeaways from our work. We have to connect education and employment through relevant, accessible coursework. We have to strengthen advising and mentoring to give students a successful education to employment transition. And we have to make this pathway more purposeful by doing more to give students applied and experiential learning. A lot of this is captured in this slide, which is about what we call the SHIPs. You can see it: mentorships, internships, relationships, apprenticeships. All of these have the potential to give every student a really purposeful journey from education to work. And you know, I was telling someone about this today, and I don't want to indulge too much sort of personal history here, but you know, I have a son, my youngest kid, who's a senior in college. He's studying physics. You know, God bless him. He didn't get that talent from me. And he, you know, he didn't have any real sort of work experiences in his field until last summer. He'd been a camp counselor, which he loved, and we were very happy to have him do that. But he kind of thought maybe he should find something that would help with the transition. So he found a job at a digital marketing firm where they needed people who could analyze big data sets. Don't ask me exactly what they do, but they do something with data, and he knows how to do it. And they kind of liked him, and he kind of liked them, and they offered him a job when he graduates. And so that was it. You know, I'm not by any means suggesting it's always that simple or everyone is so fortunate, But I think that does just give you a sense that you can take something, you know, liberal arts college, particular kind of major, maybe a little theoretical, and then you can actually turn that into something that, you know, we hope will turn out to be a satisfying first job.
I'm curious, Marni, as you kind of hear the takeaways here, so we're talking about connections with employers, mentorship. Do you see that manifest at your school, and kind of how?
Absolutely. I mean, as you were walking through your presentation, I was like, yep. So, yeah, you know, as any college centers in on students, really becomes student-centered if they have the will to do it. And there really aren't that many institutions out there who do. It really shifts the atlas of what's really important to focus on. And so absolutely, obviously at WGU, we're totally online. We have tackled the challenge of time for students. You know, even with traditional age students 18 to 24, a larger and larger percentages of those students are working part-time or even full-time while they go to school, full-time. And the current incumbent educational model just doesn't serve those students, just does not have the flexibility to allow them to do that, which they need to do because, oh, by the way, higher education is getting more expensive year over year. Having a job is important for most students to make it through. Yet we are still in higher education having what I feel is a ridiculous debate about whether online education is viable and should exist at all and should be valued at all. Every time I read the latest trade press article about online education, questioning whether or not it is good for students or good for certain profiles of students, I'm floored that we're still having this conversation in the digital age and in a context where students, many of them have to work full-time while they go to school, and so the flexibility is not an option. Not all students can go to school full-time, work part-time, or not at all, and live in the dorm. That's over.
And that's also not who is going to college today.
It's not who's going to college today, and we know that. So why are we even having this conversation? Let's move on. Let's figure out how to do it right. So that's one thing we've thought a lot about at WGU, and I think we do it really well. It's a central part of who we are in terms of figuring out how to best serve students where they are and when they can study. Certainly this notion of currency, the currency or value of the degrees and the credentials that we're offering is very important to us. When we design curricula at WGU, we start by creating a marketable skills map and defining competencies, which are sort of higher order skills, and verifying our understanding of that with industry, but also with academics in fields of study, so that we make sure that we are aligned with what students need. And we do that dynamically, because what students need and what employers need and what the worlds of researchers out there need in terms of skill sets and competencies on the part of students, that's shifting in our world pretty quickly.
Can you give an example of something?
Sure. So we also work with MZ, as well as other third-party labor market providers and industry councils to create detailed maps of fields, for example, cybersecurity or elementary education or nursing. So those fields are basically being a professional in those fields and thriving as a professional in those fields as they evolve in the future of work requires certain known skill sets. And these could be micro skills like being able to wield Excel in a particular way, or being able to draw blood, or whatever. They're technical skills, but they're also complex, higher order competencies around being able to communicate effectively, or being able to work in teams, diverse teams, or being able to interact with people from other cultures. So there are micro skills, let's call them, and macro skills that make up the map of what it is to be a nurse, or that make up a map of what it is to be a marketing professional, or a cybersecurity ethical hacker, or whatever, right? And so we're very explicit when we create curriculum. It's not a set of courses with a syllabus that's controlled by a particular faculty member with a particular expertise. It is a systematic science and, I would say, artful approach for creating skills maps that we then lay out curriculum on top of. And as students then make their way through that program, the cybersecurity program, for example, there isn't just one win at the end. You know, that's the thing about 4-year degrees or 6-year degrees is it takes 4 to 6 years to get it. And you invest all of that time and all of that money, and unless you finish, you got nothing. In fact, you got less than nothing, because you're in debt and you're a dropout. Right? So we don't believe in that. We believe that every competency that a student earns is a value. And if they have to leave us for a time and then come back and finish their degree later, we want to make sure that when they leave, they have something of value to take with them that's recognized in industry. And so these maps really help us to do that, because as students are moving through a program, they're earning incremental value along the way. And we have a big project right now where we're really working on how can we transcript that value in ways that they can own and share with industry. So that's part of what we do. And I think it is a different mindset around developing curriculum than is traditional in higher education.
I'm also kind of wondering, and James, you can weigh in here too, about kind of the barriers or the hurdles that institutions would have around making changes like this. I mean, I would think that universities would hear kind of Ben's research and say, like, let's make some changes. Why not? So in higher education, we need to be a lot more nimble and open to input from folks we're not used to listening to. But instead, we tend to be clumsy with the details and closed off to really important input. So we're focused on an agenda of a baseline of transparency and public participation in higher education across the country. And I'll give you a few examples where I think those barriers show up very concretely, and we need to do a lot better in this country. So first, I think our clumsiness starts very early on in the relationship with a student. It actually starts with prospective students. You know, we're really good at telling a story in higher education about success, and we're very clumsy when it comes to conveying consequential details about what that investment means. A couple of examples. So last year, New America and You Aspire did a great report that audited the financial aid award letters from institutions across the country. And what they found was that the letters are really all over the place. They're very unclear when it comes to what it means for a student who's about to make a major investment. And so there's discrepancy between how students it's communicated to them and how they understand things like whether money coming to them is in the form of a grant or something they are supposed to pay back in a loan. That's how confusing it is. And so our clumsy selves are creating these barriers. We're confusing people about that very investment up front. And it doesn't really stop there. You know, again, as we're selling higher education to consumers and telling them only the good things, and I think we do need to say those things, we also need to not hide the ball when it comes to graduation, retention, student debt, what a student and family is likely to face in increases in tuition and fees over a period of time, default,
repayment, and all sorts of other things. And so we hide those things, and we hope that a family, maybe they'll pull those things off of iPads as they're making some college decision, which is a ludicrous kind of thought. So, so we're hiding the ball when it comes to the very front end piece.
And iPads are data that schools put out that are often, even for a journalist, pretty hard to find.
Right, so, that's true. And so on the academic side of the house, we're too closed off to input. And so those of you who are from community college or technical college context might be familiar with the idea of a program advisory committee. This is where, you will bring in experts in the field and ask them questions about, how well is our curriculum shaped to meet the needs of graduates so that they can go and work in those very fields that these folks represent. And, by and large in this country, our institutions either don't have program advisory committees or they're not doing them very well. And again, I think it's generally because we're closed off to the expertise of others. We think we know exactly how to do it, and we want to make sure that we do it our way. And I think it's a time to broaden the participation of experts outside of our institutions. On the administrative side of the house, we don't know how to serve consumers because we don't know how to marshal our own resources internally to maximize the investment of those consumers. And so I'll give you an example. I mean, if you ask the average CFO of an institution around the country about how program level costs differ, they really wouldn't be able to give you that answer. They see it as one sum number that's then distributed across each and every student in that college, even though they don't necessarily incur the same cost, or they don't cause the same cost because they're in various programs, and they don't take on services the same way. And so I envision a future where we are so we're so in control, we so understand our costs at the program and unit level that a student can come in even beyond we think of affordable pathway just as, credential to 2-year or certification to 2-year or 2-year into 4-year. But I see a future where you can have an affordable pathway in a university context where we can unbundle all of these costs that are currently laid on everybody, and a student can choose how not to take on each of those costs and avoid the cost of his expensive services or amenities that they don't need, and we can give greater choice to students. And last, I'll just close by saying we're also closed off when it comes to governance in higher education. So the vast majority of US states have boards of trustees or regents that are not required by law to take the input of the very consumers that they serve. So about 10 states in the country, Virginia is about to be the newest because our organization was working on legislation and a bill just passed the General Assembly that requires all Virginia institutions to take public comment before they make decisions on tuition rates. And at a time in higher education around the country where spending is on the rebound in the vast majority of US states, it's time for us to think about the connection between state appropriations, the cost of it, and the prices that we set. And those same states also don't provide training for trustees who are in charge of billion-dollar enterprises in these states. And so I think we've got a lot of work to do, and those are some of the very glaring areas that I think we can work with policymakers and institutions on.
Yeah. Ben and Marni, do you want to weigh in on kind of just tension points that you see?
Yeah, I would just to follow on when it comes to data transparency and understanding the relationship between your costs and the impacts for students and your operating model. WGU is really committed to understanding our student metrics and the relationship of those metrics to what we do and what we invest in. And it was I have been at WGU for 20 months, and it was one of the most amazing things to me when I first got there that the entire university and college and service leadership sits down together bi-weekly to look at our key performance indicators across all of our student populations. And then we have teams who do root cause and reason about what's going on if we are really knocking one of those KPIs, as we call them, out of the water, or if we're missing them. And that takes a whole mindset and infrastructure and institutional will to not only surface those numbers, analyze those numbers, commit to solving for those numbers, but then also commit to continuously improving our practice. That is where I see many institutions fall down there. Everybody wants the data, and everybody has big data, and everybody's putting services together to surface the data. But the fact is that when you're solving for problems of student success, and when you're really centered on making sure that everything you do serves students well, not just students in the aggregate, but individual students well, then you have to have the will to change, and you have to have the leverage to change what's going on in your organization. And that's a big blocker, because a lot of organizations do not have that will. And when we talk about student success in particular, you know, I have been at several institutions where we've looked at our student services and our student success operations. So enrollment, strategic enrollment management, prospect management, advising, balloon arches, all of the things that we do to serve students across the life cycle. I think those groups in universities are likely to be looking at their data and driving change. But oftentimes the change that's really needed is in the curriculum itself and the instructional interventions and practices of the faculty, and that's almost never touched by this analysis.
It's a taboo.
It's a taboo. And if you do surface that analysis of a problem with the structure of curriculum, or toxicity in the structure of different terms, or a problem with faculty attitudes, or the way that faculty are teaching, if you do surface that data, which you probably won't, if you do, there's very little that you can do about it. It's not part of the student success conversation, and I think that's a problem. That's a giant blocker in higher education institutions being able to move forward and serve students better.
Which is
but I do want to say, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that's so different from K-12, in which kind of teacher evaluations are much more, we talk about that much more often.
It's very different.
Yeah. Go ahead,
Although arguably even K-12 teacher evaluations don't
we
necessarily change a whole lot. But no, all I was going to say is I think that, in a way, I mean, I was thinking about this question of transparency, and I think the transparency sort of has to move flow in different directions. You know, yes, students need more information. They need information probably earlier in more user-friendly forms, and I think that we're moving somewhat in that direction, but probably not quite as universally or as quickly as we should. Colleges also need to be receptive to information about like consumer needs, and I do want to say I don't think this is about the colleges always being, I don't want to bash, colleges and universities. It's one of our great sectors nationally. We have a tremendous higher ed system, with lots of different entry points for different kinds of students, and I don't think we should lose sight of that, but it's kind of like a tale of two cities. I mean, we have great elite institutions, and we have a lot of good mass access, but we have a lot of people who aren't getting as much as they should, whether it's graduation outcomes, or whether it's, successful, or purposeful, let's call it, employment outcomes. And I think that colleges, it's not that they're, we can, roll our eyes about how they're, stick in the muds about this or that, but they're really dealing with sort of competing pressures and imperatives. If you're like a big state flagship, you're supposed to, if you're UT Austin, you're serving the students of the state, but you're also trying to be a nationally and globally prominent research university, so you're going to devote a bunch of resources to research, and there's a good case for doing them. That's always part of the mission of a university. It's seeking the truth. It should not be a choice between not having good career services, let's say. And I'm not, for all I know, they have great career services. I'm just saying that, life is choices, and so when you're pushed in one direction, then that may mean that you have less energy or resources to devote to something else. And I do think, colleges, I'm thinking about, another small liberal arts college where computer science is now the most popular major. So in that sense, they listen to consumers. If students sign up for the major, they will expand the major and make it bigger. But whether they are doing this more broadly, so the kids who are art history majors can go ahead with that major, but still get the kind of advising, the kind of mentorships, the kind of apprenticeships, the kind of internships that will help them make their way, that's a different way of looking at things. And so I think that there's work to be done in the traditional sector and in the sort of more innovative places like WGU. But I think that I think certainly what we're hoping to do with like this University Innovation Alliance, grant on career services is to work with these institutions, not to beat them up, but to help them get better.
Great. Well, kind of along those lines, I wonder if each of you has an example of kind of a small change or an example of listening to a student or adapting a policy based on kind of a response from a student.
I'll go.
Okay.
So this past year, we ran again, I mentioned our organization is focused on affordability and the rise in college costs. And so our organization ran a pilot at Virginia Commonwealth University, large research institution in the city of Richmond, and also a billion-dollar enterprise. And as I had mentioned, spending across the country is up, although it hasn't reached pre-recession levels in terms of per student spending. But we have reversed this trend in the country when it comes to the great disinvestment in higher education. And so when we look at that scenario, we ask ourselves, why isn't there corresponding restraint? There's no reason to necessarily have 5% increases in spending and also then pass on 5% increases to students. And we marvel at places like Purdue University where they've held tuition and fees constant for 8 years straight. That's been totally voluntary. So at Virginia Commonwealth, what we did is we hypothesized, well, what if we just told students the facts about a pending tuition decision? And the institution had projected 6.8 to about 8.1% in a tuition increase in that given year. We started running geo-targeted Facebook advertising around Virginia Commonwealth University to tell the students, here's the pending decision, here's who's making the decision, and here's the potential consequences of that decision. And lo and behold, what happens when you tell people the facts? They engage with those facts. And so in about a 7-day period of this pilot, 400 students sent 1,200 emails to publicly available email addresses to weigh in on this pending decision. And the institution did decide to taper the increase down as a result of that. And so, we were very encouraged by that, to know that there's, that we could be a connection between, consumers who are underinformed about decisions in higher education and those who are ultimately making the decisions. And oftentimes that's in a very small room, with perhaps a very elite group of people, whether that's board members or senior cabinet members in an institution.
Well, I'll throw out very quickly too. So one is just, I happened to meet somebody from California who'd worked at, I forget, maybe it was PG&E or one of the big corporation in California, or maybe it was utility, and it was about employer-sponsored education programming. And it's something very simple, but basically they had, like many corporations, they had a program where people could go back and get credits, because we know there's a massive market and there will be even more in upskilling or reskilling adult students. But a lot of people are not in a position to front the money for classes and then to get reimbursed afterwards. So they flipped it. So they would give them the money up front. And I imagine that comes with a certain level of administrative difficulty. But they did it, and I'm sorry I can't cite the numbers, but there was a huge uptick in the number of students who were going back and doing something that was good for them. It was good for the company, for retention, and for human capital. So that's something very simple. Sometimes program design. And I think, I will mention something here in Texas. Paul Quinn College again, it's a grantee of Strada, but it's a really fascinating place, and it's a model that you see in various forms at places like Northeastern with its co-op model and other schools where students work while they're in school. And so the idea is that you go through school, you study, you work, they have a lot of connections with the business world, so students are doing sort of real-world stuff while they're in school, but they're also studying. They develop something of a network so that when they finish, I believe they typically have pretty low or no debt, and they have a good entree into the jobs world. So again, going back to this, it's not either or, it's both and. That's not the model for everyone, but I think that if we're going to have a sort of an ecosystem with lots of different pathways, that would be a really good one to consider doing more with.
Yeah.
So it's hard to answer this question because we actually look at satisfaction rates on every single aspect of our student experience. We collect data on that and we review it biweekly. We also do surveys, and we also have a group, a full-time group at WGU that constantly does focus groups on areas of concern with students. And so we are changing aspects of our curriculum and services and kind of user experience model very dynamically. Recently, a couple of things that came to mind that I think are pretty cool. One is that we were getting a lot of student feedback on our transcript evaluation process, so the crosswalking of credit that they received at other institutions to their WGU transcript. And so we had a team that formed to look into that and basically went across every single program and relooked at all of our crosswalks and articulation agreements with community colleges and other colleges.
So just for folks transferring in.
To make sure that that process was optimized, not only in terms of giving credit where credit was due, but in the time that it takes to do it. So we significantly reduced the time to process thousands and thousands of these crosswalks to not only the benefit of students getting an answer more quickly, but also getting more credit for what they had done in previous learning experiences. So that's one. And another project that we're working on is in many of our degrees, we actually allow students to do third-party credentials or certifications during, as part of courses or as part of terms that we then credit into their degree pathways. So we have certain degrees, especially in our IT college, where students will earn between 12 and 18 professional certifications as part of their degree. And this is awesome, but those certifications are all held, like the transcript for those certifications are all held by those certification providers, and students are having to scramble together to get them, to put them together for employers. So we got a lot of requests to be able to sort of put all of those achievements on one transcript. So we have done that. We have a prototype that's actually live for students where we do that now, but we're also doing a lot of really interesting user experience designs with students to design that transcript for the future. And it's just amazing really what they come up with beyond our intuition about what should be on a transcript from our perspective. It's very interesting to get students involved in that kind of design work because they will always surprise you, and it's always totally awesome what they come up with because they're the users. And so we're very committed to that practice, and I think that any university, whether they're a research university or whether they're a student-focused, student-serving university like WGU, really needs to put the focus into working with students in this way. And I don't think it's bashing other universities by saying that that's necessary. I think that that's just, it's good practice, no matter what in the end your mission is, or if you have a mission for both research and teaching, bringing students into the fold and really adopting student-centeredness as a primary ethic of doing business. It works.
So we have about 15 minutes left here, so I want to open this up if you all have questions here in this room. We're using Slido. I don't know if you're familiar with that. You can do it on your phones or on your computers to submit questions. We have a couple that have come in already, so I'm going to throw out to that, which is, and this caught my eye because you're talking about how education leaders, 95% say, oh, we're matched for employers. Everything's all good here. So this question is, how do you convince senior academic leaders who think they are already well educating students for a future career to change their response, change what they do? Thoughts?
Well, I wish I had an easy answer, but I think over time, there was actually something that I saw, I think in Inside Higher Ed the other day. There was a survey of faculty, and it had to do with faculty's feeling that guiding and mentoring students was an important responsibility, and the figures are actually pretty high. So I guess I don't think this stuff is written in stone. I would hope that, we have a changing labor force, we have changing needs, we're definitely, I mean, we haven't talked much about rankings. I actually forgot to mention in my intro that I have a dark past as the editor of the U.S. News and World Report College Guide. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about rankings. And, you know, I think that, I think that we are in an age of sort of, we talked about transparency. We're in some sense, we're still in the age of the consumer. It doesn't mean we're perfectly there, but I think people understand increasingly that we need more information to have a sort of marketplace where people can make good decisions. And I think that people understand that they are going to have to listen to students as part of doing their job well. So that's the very, very fuzzy answer, but I think it's going to happen. I can't tell you exactly the levers to push, but it sounds like maybe Marni can. Oh, no, I can't. I mean, I really think that this is a difficult problem because there is a tension between the very academic freedom, and that's very important, and this notion of relevancy and currency, right? And it's the same tension as the tension between the need to make sure that students have enduring skills and competencies in the arts and sciences, as well as professional and technical skills. I mean, these are tensions. You just can't get over it, but yet we have to. So I think the couple of pieces of advice on this front I can give is just that, first of all, obviously with any kind of change, you need a change champion. And that change champion, you need a change champion at the executive level. You need a change champion at the level of the faculty who are directly involved with the project. That's so important. You really can't do anything without that. I think another really important piece of advice on this front is that, you know, it's one thing to say that you need to make sure that a curriculum or a program or even a course is relevant to industry, relevant to the future of work. It's another thing to really give a faculty member the evidence that they need to understand what that even means. So for example, at WGU, part of the reason we're working on these skills maps is because what's the point of reference for doing that? You know, I have my opinion as a faculty member. Who's to say that I'm wrong? Well, these maps help a faculty member to see how their vision of a course maybe aligns with something that would be valuable for industry. And I think just being able to show that and share that with faculty members, these are really smart people. They're going to see it, get all kinds of great creative ideas around it, and they're going to use it. But oftentimes, we just talk in these sort of this high level about we need to be more relevant, we need courses to present marketable skills. What does that even mean? I think we need to do a better job at laying out for any given institution operationally, what does that mean? And where are we going to get that intelligence? And then how are we going to encourage faculty and leadership to creatively pick that intelligence up and put it to good use in the curriculum? Yeah. But I would say, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. It's a tension, but a tension is something you can work with, and I think, you know, that's doable. And I would also say, I mean, if you think about the history of American higher ed, I mean, we sometimes think of, you know, higher ed folks they're just purists and they won't do anything practical. But, you know, ministers, you know, in training, going to, you know, Harvard, learning Latin and Greek, were doing a sort of education that had some relevance to what they were going to be doing as ministers. And if you think about the land grant, you know, the creation of all the land grants in the second half of the 19th century, there was a big, you know, you can still go to Iowa State and major in animal science. That's not an accident. And that's not the only thing you study when you're there. But I would just say in practice, the current, it's not as if American higher ed is all philosophers and no welders. It's really a mixture. And the mix kind of varies by institution. But you can see something that has, you know, career relevance in many places. You know, 1/4 of undergraduate majors in this country are business majors, for better or for worse.
Well, one of the questions that we're getting is kind of how can institutions, schools work with employers to figure out potentially that map? Do you guys have suggestions or things that you've seen that worked?
Yeah, my meta suggestion is I think it's a shame that every institution I'm talking to across the country is going out and creating their map of the same thing. Their map of cybersecurity, their map of marketing, their map of nursing. I mean, this is a lot of money and time being spent. I'm sure that MZ and Burning Glass and others are very happy about this situation, but it's really a shame, because these maps should be maps of truth, right? And we should all be working from the same truth. So one suggestion is that we all band together and build coalitions to create these maps across institutions. We should feel that there's no special sauce in these maps. They're just a reading of what is valued by industry. They're a reading of skills that are marketable. And they are a dynamic reading, so you don't just do it right. You really have to do it year over year over year to really make sure that they're mapping to what's real. So that's one suggestion. But really, if no, then I think working with labor insight providers, there are a lot of them out there. MZ is one of them. Burning Glass is one of them. There are others. Credential Engine. Really engaging with these partners. They have rich wells of intelligence that are getting better every day. They can help you put these maps together and tag them back to different fields of study and disciplines. The formation of industry councils at the program level is also something that is incredibly invaluable for being able to develop and dynamically improve over time curriculum. So those are tactics, but I think we as a higher education system are missing the boat by not engaging in the development of these maps together, agreeing on them together, and then we can build all sorts of curriculum over that map. I call it the Light-Bright board. I don't know if any of you remember Light-Bright from back in the day, but if you think of the map as the black set of holes, you can put any number of pegs and make all kinds of program designs over that holes, but getting that map of holes, that's the foundational step, and I really do think we should do it together.
Where's your slide? I want to see that slide.
I really need a slide.
You just need to bring one, I think.
I know. I have one at home. My kids are always messing with it.
I've seen some questions come across about kind of the role of faculty here, which was not something I had thought about before this panel in terms of kind of bringing faculty in, including part-time adjunct faculty, into these conversations around change and student-centeredness. I wonder if...
I don't have an answer. I'll just say that I think it's critically important, because so many of our adjunct faculty, and I was one, brought to bear that, hate to say it, but the real world experience that students are in desperate need of. And I can remember my experience as an adjunct faculty. I so wanted to be part of the team, and never quite felt like I was in, and yet I can recall the student feedback on my work as being, that's what students valued about me. So I was there for the thing I wanted students to value about me. They valued that, but yet it wasn't recognized by the faculty writ large and by the institution. So I think I don't know the answer to that, but I think that's a great question, and seems to me to be a really important part of the puzzle. Especially, as so many of our colleges are under financial stress and heavily rely on adjunct faculty, and that's not a situation that's going away anytime soon. In fact, again, I think that's the great value of adjunct faculty is all right, here's how it really is. And I know that's somewhat of an insult to full-time faculty, which I don't mean, but I think if we're that's one way to look at it.
Yeah, and I think there have to be, if you're truly going to be student-centered, there have to be tools that surface intelligence about students to faculty so that faculty can put that intelligence to good use. And that is missing in most institutions, and especially with adjunct faculty or with faculty who are teaching very large classes, it's difficult to see the students, and so therefore we are not empowering and enabling faculty to really be student-centered themselves. And the good ones always are, and will knock themselves out being student-centered. But that is something that's a mission that they have to take on, despite the fact that the tools are not really there for them to do it well in most cases.
Well, in a way, I mean, you could say it's almost a subset of the difficulty getting faculty to focus on teaching. Obviously, there are institutions where that's their main job, but for the places where they have other jobs too, like research and service, it's very tough. And you need to build it into evaluations. You need to add it to tenure criteria, but that has not been a great success, I think. But if it's not only teaching, but it's also maybe again mentoring, advising, helping forge connections with the business world. And I mean, I find myself thinking, I mean, we certainly would love to solve this, but there is a kind of culture, aspect to this, which is huge. And again, I think there's a spectrum of institutions, there's a spectrum of faculty. There are some who really take this seriously, but I think in a way you do have to persuade people that, if you're a French lit professor, this does not mean that somebody is going to require you to start, training people in vocational ways. That's not it. It's helping them understand how the things they're studying will create the kinds of skills that can get them ahead in life, and that is not, again, maybe a tension, but that is not a conflict.
Liberal arts or, technical programs, we still all should be trying to get people employed, right? We talk about that, this tension between, institutions that are training people for jobs or otherwise engaged in a democratic society. I think that's a very silly choice. The people who vote the most around the world are people who have the highest incomes. Those who are most engaged in their communities are the folks who have the highest incomes. They are gainfully employed. And so whether you're an English literature major, or you're an engineer, or you're in automotive repair, you still want to be gainfully employed, and you will go on and be a engaged member of a democratic society. I don't think it's one or the other.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is time for us. Thank you guys for sticking around. And sorry we didn't get to all your questions, but we'll hang around if you want to ask some questions.